My daughter looked me dead in the eye on Christmas night and said, "Dad, I need you to leave." Not asked, told. The whole table went quiet. My son-in-law stared at his plate, my grandchildren were in the next room, and my wife of 32 years, just sat there, sipping her wine like she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. I put my napkin on the table, stood up, and walked out. But what my daughter didn't know, what nobody in that house knew, was that I had already done something that would destroy every single one of them within 48 hours. I had cut off every dollar. Not just gifts, not just allowances, everything. The house my daughter lived in, the car she drove, the private school her kids attended, the business her husband ran, the loans nobody knew about, all of it. Mine. And on Christmas night, I finally pulled the plug. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because to understand why I did what I did, you need to understand what they did to me first. And it started a long time ago. I met Diane in 1991. I was 23 working at my father's hardware store in Cleveland, Ohio. She was 21, finishing her degree at Cleveland State. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Sharp eyes, cold smile. The kind of woman who walked into a room and made every other person feel like furniture. I should have seen it then. But I was young and stupid. And my mother told me I was lucky. That was the first mistake. Listening to my mother. My mother, Helen, was a controller. She didn't give advice, she gave orders disguised as love. "Marry that girl, Michael. She's got class. She'll lift you up." What my mother really meant was, Diane came from money. Not a lot of money. But more than us. And Helen had spent her whole life trying to climb out of the working-class neighborhood she was trapped in. My father, Frank, just watched. He always just watched. 37 years of marriage to Helen, and the man had learned to speak only when spoken to. He'd nod, he'd agree. He'd go back to his workshop in the basement and build birdhouses nobody asked for. I didn't want to be my father. So I married Diane. The wedding was in April 1992, and it should have been the happiest day of my life. But it was the first day I realized I wasn't marrying a woman. I was marrying her entire family. Diane's mother, Margaret, was worse than my mother. If Helen was a controller, Margaret was a surgeon. She cut people with precision. She'd say things like, "Oh, Michael, you look nice in that suit. It's amazing what a good tailor can do, isn't it?" Smiling the whole time, every word a knife. At the wedding reception, Margaret pulled me aside. She said, "I know Diane loves you. But love fades, Michael. Money doesn't. Make sure you take care of my daughter." I laughed nervously. I thought she was joking. She wasn't. Then my own mother had to get involved. Helen pulled Diane aside at the same reception and told her, "If he ever raises his voice to you, you call me. I'll handle him." Diane smiled at my mother and said, "Don't worry, Helen. Michael won't raise his voice. He's not that kind of man." My mother smiled back like they were allies. And I stood there between two women who had already decided who I was without asking me. But the real humiliation came later that night. During the toast, Diane's older brother Richard, drunk by 7 p.m., stood up and said, "I just want to say, my sister finally found a man who's willing to work hard. Because God knows she can't marry someone who's already got something. She had to build one from scratch." The room laughed. My father looked down at his hands. My mother laughed too. And Diane, my bride, laughed the hardest. I smiled. I played along. I told myself it was just a joke. But something broke inside me that night. Something small, a crack. And I spent the next 30 years pretending I couldn't feel the cold air blowing through it. The first 5 years of marriage were quiet. We had our daughter Sarah in 1993. Then our son Kevin in 1995. I was working 60 hours a week at the hardware store, and then I started buying properties on the side, foreclosures, cheap houses. I'd fix them up myself at night and rent them out. Diane didn't like that I smelled like drywall and paint when I came to bed. She'd turn away from me. She'd say, "Can you shower first? The smell gives me a headache." So I'd shower at 2 in the morning and slip into bed like a ghost in my own house. Meanwhile, Diane's mother was at our house 4 days a week. Margaret would reorganize our kitchen. She'd throw out food she didn't think was good enough. She'd tell Diane, in front of me, "You married a good worker bee, sweetheart, but you need to make sure the hive stays organized." I was a worker bee, that's what my mother-in-law called me, and my wife never corrected her. My own mother wasn't better. Helen would call every Sunday and ask, "Is Diane treating you right?" But she didn't really want to know. She wanted to hear that everything was fine so she could tell her friends her son was doing well. If I ever hinted at a problem, she'd say, "Marriage is hard, Michael. Your father and I have had our fights. You just keep going. Keep going." That was my mother's answer to everything. Don't fix it. Don't confront it. Just keep going. So I did. By 2001, I had 11 rental properties. I was making more money from the rentals than from the hardware store. But nobody in my family treated me any different. I was still the guy who needed to shower before bed, still the worker bee. Then something happened that changed everything. My sister Jenny called me crying. Jenny was 3 years younger than me. She'd married a man named Doug Patterson in 1996. Doug was a salesman, charming at first. But behind closed doors, he was something else. Jenny told me that Doug had been hitting her. Not for the first time, but for the third year in a row. She showed me bruises on her arms. She said she'd tried to leave twice and he'd threatened to kill her. I lost my mind. I drove to Doug's house that night. I was going to kill him. I mean it. I was 20 minutes away from doing something that would have put me in prison for the rest of my life. But Diane called me. She said, "Michael, if you go over there and do something stupid, you will ruin this family. Do you hear me? You will ruin us." Jenny made her bed. Let her lie in it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I said, "She's your sister-in-law. She's being beaten." Diane said, "And what exactly do you plan to do about it? You're not a violent man, Michael. You've never even raised your voice to me. You think you can suddenly become some hero? You'll just make it worse." She wasn't wrong about one thing. I wasn't violent. I had never raised my voice. Not to Diane. Not to anyone. I had spent my entire life being calm and quiet and agreeable. And Diane knew it. She knew I wouldn't go through with it. I turned the car around. I went home. I took a shower. I went to bed. And I never forgave myself for it. But here's the part that really gets me. The next day, my mother called. I told her about Jenny, and Helen said, "Well, she should have married better. You can't fix everyone's problems, Michael." My own mother, my sister, was being beaten, and both the women in my life, my wife and my mother, told me to stay out of it. So I did. And Jenny stayed with Doug for 7 more years. During those 7 years, something shifted in my house, slowly, quietly, like a foundation rotting underneath a beautiful home. Diane started making decisions without me. She'd redesign rooms, she'd change the kids' schools, she'd invite her family over for holidays without asking me first. And when I'd question it, not angrily, just question it, she'd say, "I'm just keeping things running, Michael. You're always working. Someone has to actually manage this family." And I'd back down. Because that's what I did. I backed down. My son Kevin started pulling away from me around age 12. He was closer to Diane's brother Richard than he was to me. Richard would take Kevin to baseball games, give him money, buy him things. And Kevin started looking at me like I was just the guy who paid the bills. Sarah was different. Sarah was always watching. She saw everything. She saw how Diane spoke to me. She saw how Margaret treated me. She saw how I just took it. But Sarah didn't defend me either. She learned from her mother. By the time Sarah was 15, she was a junior version of Diane. Cold, calculating, she could say the cruelest thing in the sweetest voice. And she'd watch you crumble with those sharp eyes and feel nothing. One night, Sarah and I had an argument about her curfew. I said she needed to be home by 11. She looked at me and said, "Mom says you don't get to make rules about things you're never around for." I said, "I'm around. I'm the one paying for everything you have." Sarah said, "Mom says that's the only thing you're good for." She was 15, and she said it with a smile. Diane was in the next room. She heard every word. She didn't come out. She didn't correct Sarah, because Sarah was just repeating what Diane had been saying for years. I sat down at the kitchen table that night and realized something terrible. I had no one, not my wife, not my daughter, not my son, not my mother, not my sister. I was completely alone in a house full of people. In 2008, Jenny finally left Doug. She showed up at my door at 6 in the morning with a black eye, 2 garbage bags of clothes, and her 4-year-old son, Tyler. Diane opened the door, looked at Jenny, looked at the bags, and said, "This is not a shelter, Jenny." I pushed past Diane. I brought Jenny inside. I gave her the guest room. Diane and I had a fight that night, the biggest one of our marriage. She said, "You're bringing that woman and her problems into our home. What does that teach our children? That it's okay to be a victim?" I said, "She's my sister." Diane said, "She's a grown woman who made bad choices, and now you want me to clean up the mess." I said, "She has a black eye, Diane." Diane said, And I have a husband who never stands up for himself in his own home, but suddenly wants to play hero for someone else. That sentence, that one sentence, it haunted me for years, because she was right. Not about Jenny, but about me. I had never stood up for myself. Not once. Jenny stayed with us for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Diane made her life miserable. She'd accidentally throw away Jenny's food. She'd make comments about Tyler being loud. She'd tell Jenny, "You know, if you'd just gone to therapy instead of playing victim, you wouldn't be in this situation." Jenny came to me crying one night and said, "Mike, I can't stay here. Your wife hates me." I wanted to say, "Then where will you go?" But I knew the answer. She'd go back to Doug. Because she had nowhere else. So I did something behind Diane's back. I rented one of my properties to Jenny for $1 a month. I paid for Tyler's daycare. I bought Jenny a used car. I set her up with a lawyer. Diane didn't know. Not yet. But Margaret found out. Because Diane told her everything. Every secret. Every decision. Margaret knew more about my finances than I did. Margaret called me and said, "Michael, I understand you're giving your sister free rent. That's very generous. But Diane tells me you didn't discuss this with her, and in a marriage financial decisions are made together." I said, "It's my property, Margaret." She said, "It's your family's property, there's a difference." I hung up. But the damage was done. Because Margaret didn't just call me, she called a family meeting. Diane, Richard, Margaret, and Diane's father, Harold, who never spoke but always showed up to vote against me, sat me down in Margaret's living room and told me I was undermining the marriage by helping Jenny. Richard said, "You're enabling her, Mike. She needs to figure it out on her own." I looked at Richard. The man who was drunk at my wedding. The man who called me a worker bee. The man who had been arrested for a DUI in 2003 that Diane's family hid from everyone. I wanted to say all of that. I wanted to destroy him right there. But I didn't. Because I was still that man. The quiet one. The one who took it. I said, "Fine, I'll stop helping Jenny." And I didn't stop. I just got better at hiding it. Years passed. 2010, 2012, 2015. The properties grew. I now had 23 of them. I had quietly taken over my father's hardware store when Frank retired. I was making over $1 million a year, but nobody knew, not really, because Diane controlled the household money. I gave her my paycheck, she paid the bills, she managed the accounts, and she gave me an allowance. $300 a week. For a man making over $1 million a year, I didn't fight it. Because fighting meant conflict. And conflict meant Diane would call Margaret. And Margaret would call a meeting. And I'd sit in that living room again and feel like a child being scolded. So I kept my rental money separate. Cash. I had a safe in the basement of one of my properties that Diane didn't know about. Over the years I had saved over $400,000 in cash. It wasn't a plan. Not at first, it was survival. Sarah got married in 2016. She married a man named Brandon. Brandon came from a wealthy family in Shaker Heights. Nice house, good job, polite. But Brandon was weak. The kind of weak that looks like cooperation. He'd agree with everything Sarah said. He'd laugh when she made fun of people. He had no backbone, just like me. At the wedding, I paid for everything. $50,000. The venue, the food, the dress, the honeymoon, all of it. Because Diane said, "This is what fathers do, Michael." Margaret said, "It's the least you can do." After all, Sarah had to overcome a lot growing up with the household dynamic she had. I knew what she meant. She meant me. She meant that I was the obstacle Sarah had to overcome. And at that same wedding, my mother pulled me aside and said, "You know, Michael, Sarah really stepped up. She became a strong woman despite not having a strong male role model." My own mother. Saying that to me. At my daughter's wedding. I smiled. I nodded. I went back to the reception and drank scotch alone at the bar, while my wife danced with her brother and my daughter. Danced with her new husband, and my son sat in the corner on his phone. My father found me at the bar. Frank. Quiet, broken Frank. He sat down next to me and didn't say anything for 10 minutes. Then he said, "You know, I had a safe too." I looked at him. He said, "Basement, behind the workbench. 40 years I kept money hidden from your mother." Not because I hated her, but because I needed something that was just mine. Something nobody could take. Something nobody could control. He finished his drink. He stood up. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Don't wait as long as I did, kid." Then he walked away. That was the most my father had ever said to me in one sitting. In 2018, Jenny called me with news. Doug had been arrested, not for beating her, for beating his second wife, a woman named Lisa. Lisa had pressed charges. Doug was going to prison for 3 years. Jenny was shaking on the phone. She said, "It should have been me. I should have been the one who sent him to prison. But I was too scared, and nobody helped me. Nobody helped me." She didn't say it directly, but I heard it. I said, "Jenny, I'm sorry." She said, "You were the only one who tried, Mike. I know that, but trying isn't enough. You should have done more." She was right, and I had to live with that. But then Jenny said something that planted a seed in my head. She said, "You know what Doug always said? He said that the reason he could hit me and get away with it was because nobody in my family would actually do anything. He said my brother was too soft. He said my mother didn't care." And he was right. Too soft, that's what Doug called me, and Richard called me a worker bee, and Margaret called me a provider, and my mother called me someone who wasn't a strong role model, and Diane called me someone who was only good for paying bills. They all saw the same thing, a man who would never fight back. But they were wrong. I was just waiting. In 2020, something happened that accelerated everything. Kevin, my son, came to me asking for money. $200,000. He said he wanted to start a business with Richard. I said no. First time I had ever said no to my son. Kevin looked at me like I had slapped him. He said, "Dad, what do you mean no? You have money. Mom says you make plenty." I said, "I'm not funding a business with your Uncle Richard." Kevin said, "Why? Because you don't like him?" I said, "Because Richard is going to use your money to cover his own debts. He owes $60,000 in back taxes, Kevin. Did you know that?" Kevin's face went white. He didn't know. I said, "Your mother knows. Margaret knows. They've been hiding it from you because they want you to be the one who bails him out. Not with Richard's money, with mine, with your inheritance." Kevin sat down. He was 25 years old and he looked like a child. He said, "Dad, does Mom know you're telling me this?" I said, "No. And I need you to think about something. Every major decision in your life, your school, your friends, this business idea, has it come from you or from Mom's family?" Kevin didn't answer, but I could see the answer on his face. He didn't take the money. He didn't do the business with Richard. And for a brief moment I thought maybe I had saved one of my kids. But Diane found out. She was furious. She said, "You undermined Richard. You humiliated him in front of Kevin. Do you know how that looks?" I said, "It looks like I protected my son from a bad investment." Diane said, "Richard is family, Michael. You don't do that to family." I said, "Jenny is family too." Dead silence. Diane's eyes went cold. She said, "Don't bring Jenny into this." I said, "Why? Because you treated her like garbage when she was being beaten? Because you called her a victim? Because you made her feel worthless in my own house?" Diane set down her glass. She said very quietly, "You need to be careful, Michael. You're acting like someone you're not. And I don't think you understand what happens when you change the rules of a game that's been going on for 28 years. She walked out of the room. And I realized something. Diane wasn't just cold. She was afraid. For the first time in our marriage, she was afraid of me. Not physically. But she was afraid that the man she thought she had trained and controlled was waking up. Over the next 2 years I started making moves. Quiet ones. I met with a lawyer. A woman named Patricia Alvarez, sharp, aggressive, the kind of lawyer who makes other lawyers nervous. Patricia reviewed everything. My properties, my accounts, the deed to our house, the cars, the business. She found something that changed everything. The house Diane and I had lived in for 26 years, was in my name only. I had bought it in 1996 with money from my first rental property. Diane's name was never on the deed. The cars were in my name. 3 of the rental properties were in my name. The hardware store was in my name. Diane had been telling everyone for decades that everything was ours. But legally, mathematically, objectively, it was mine. Patricia said, "Michael, your wife has been living in your house, driving your car, spending your money, and telling you that you're lucky she stays. Do you see the irony?" I saw it. Patricia said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Not yet. I need to wait for the right moment." She said, "What moment?" I said, "I'll know it when it comes." The moment came on Christmas 2023. Diane had planned the entire day. Margaret was there. Richard was there. Harold was there, sitting in his chair like a statue. Sarah and Brandon were there with their 2 kids. Kevin came alone. He'd broken up with his girlfriend a month earlier, and Diane was already trying to set him up with one of Margaret's friend's daughters. I was in the kitchen carving the turkey when I heard Margaret in the dining room talking to Sarah. Margaret said, "Brandon seems distracted lately. Is everything okay with him?" Sarah said, "He's fine, he's just stressed about work." Margaret said, "Stressed or something else? I noticed he left the room 3 times to check his phone during dinner. That's unusual." Sarah laughed. She said, "Oh, that's just Brandon, he's addicted to his phone." But I saw Sarah's face, and I knew that laugh. It was the same laugh Diane used when she was hiding something. The performative laugh. The one that says, "Move along, nothing to see here." I filed that away. Dinner was served. I sat at the head of the table. Diane sat at the other end. The grandchildren were at a small table in the corner. Margaret said grace, a long pointed grace about gratitude and family and the blessings of those who provide. She looked at me when she said provide. I ate my turkey, then Richard started in. He'd had a few drinks. He said, "Mike, I heard you're thinking about selling the hardware store. That true?" I hadn't told anyone that, but Richard always knew things because Diane told him. I said, "I'm considering it." Richard said, "That's a shame. Your father built that store. Would be a shame to see the worker bee abandon the hive." He laughed. Margaret laughed. Even Harold cracked something that might have been a smile. Nobody else laughed. Kevin looked at his plate. Sarah looked at her phone. I said, "Richard, how's your tax situation? Did you ever settle that?" The table went silent. Richard's smile disappeared. He looked at Diane. Diane gave him a look that said, "Don't." Richard said, "That's between me and the IRS, Mike." I said, $60,000 is a lot between you and the IRS. Margaret said, "Michael, this is Christmas. Let's not." I said, "You're right, Margaret. It is Christmas. Let's talk about something else. Let's talk about how Diane has been meeting with a financial advisor without telling me." Now the real silence came. Diane put down her fork. She said, "Where did you hear that?" I said, "Does it matter?" Diane said, "Michael, we can discuss this privately." I said, "Why? We discuss everything else publicly in this family. Richard's taxes, Jenny's failures, my shortcomings. Why should this be private?" Sarah said, "Dad, stop, you're ruining Christmas." I looked at Sarah. I said, "Your mother has been secretly meeting with a financial advisor for 6 months. She's been moving money, I don't know where, I don't know why, but I know it's happening." Diane stood up. Her chair scraped the floor. She said, "You want to do this here? Fine, yes. I've been meeting with a financial advisor, because I have been managing this family's finances for 28 years and I wanted to make sure we were protected." I said, "Protected from what?" Diane said, "From you." Everyone stared. She said, "From the possibility that one day you decide to lose your mind and do something reckless. I've watched you for years, Michael. The secret phone calls to Jenny, the cash you've been hiding, the properties you've been buying without telling me. Yes, I know about all of it." My heart stopped. She said, "Did you really think I didn't know? I've known about the safe in the basement of the Elm Street property for 2 years. Richard found it when he was doing plumbing work for you, remember? You asked him to help, and he found the safe, and he told me." Richard looked at his plate. Diane said, "I've been planning, Michael, because I knew this day would come. The day you'd decide to play tough. The day you'd try to take control. And I needed to be ready." I sat there, and for a moment, I felt it. That old feeling, the urge to shrink, to apologize, to back down. But then I looked at my grandchildren in the corner. And I thought about Tyler, Jenny's son, who was now 20 years old and in college on my dime. And I thought about my father, sitting in that basement building birdhouses because it was the only place he could be free. And I said, "Diane, you've been managing the money I made. In the house I bought, driving the car I paid for, while your mother called me a worker bee and your brother humiliated me at my own wedding and at my own Christmas dinner. And you let all of it happen. You encouraged it." Diane said, "I made you respectable, Michael. Without me, you'd still be in that hardware store smelling like paint, with no one to guide you." I said, "I made $1 million last year," Diane said, "and you'd have nothing without me." I said, "That's what you've always told me, but here's what I think. I think you married me because I was controllable. I think your mother saw it the day she met me. A hard-working man with no backbone. easy to manage, easy to train. And you spent 28 years turning me into an ATM with legs." Sarah slammed her hand on the table. She said, "Dad, that is enough. I have had it with this. Every holiday, every family gathering, you do this. You play the victim. You make Mom look like the bad guy. You make Grandma look cruel. But you know what the real problem is? You're weak. You've always been weak, and now you're trying to act tough, and it's pathetic." At that to me, in front of everyone, I looked at Sarah, and I felt something I had never felt before. Not anger, something colder, something final. I said, "Sarah, you live in a house that I pay for. You drive a car that I pay for. Your kids go to a school that I pay for. Brandon's business, the one you think is his, was funded with $100,000 that I gave him. Did he tell you that? Did Brandon ever mention that his father-in-law bailed out his failing business last year?" Sarah looked at Brandon. Brandon's face went red. Sarah said, "That's not true." I said, "Call him. Call your bank. The loan is in my name. It was always in my name. Brandon couldn't get approved, so I did it. And I never told you because I knew you'd find a way to spin it into something ugly." Sarah turned to Brandon. "Is that true?" Brandon said quietly, "I was going to tell you." Sarah said, "How could you not tell me?" And just like that, the fight wasn't about me anymore. Sarah and Brandon were arguing. Diane was trying to control the situation. Margaret was yelling at Richard for telling me about the safe. Kevin was just staring at me. I stood up, and that's when Sarah turned to me and said the words, "Dad, I need you to leave." I said, "This is my house, Sarah." She said, "Not tonight. Tonight it's Mom's house, and she wants you gone." Diane was standing behind Sarah. She didn't say it directly. She never did. She used Sarah. She always used Sarah. I looked at my wife. I said, "You're using our daughter as a shield, again." Diane said, "I'm asking you to leave, Michael. You've humiliated me. You've humiliated this family. You can come back when you've calmed down." I said, "I'm not coming back." Diane said, "You don't mean that." I said, "I've never meant anything more." I put my napkin on the table. I walked to the front door. I put on my coat. And I left. It was 32 degrees outside, snow on the ground, Christmas lights on every house, and I sat in my truck for 20 minutes before I drove away. The next morning, I called Patricia Alvarez. I said, "Do it." She said, "All of it?" I said, "All of it." Within 48 hours, this is what happened. The deed to Sarah and Brandon's house, which I had been paying the mortgage on secretly for 6 years, was called in. The bank notified Brandon that the full balance was due in 30 days. The loan for Brandon's business was called in. The tuition payments for the grandchildren's private school were stopped. The credit card I had given Diane, the one she thought was a joint account but was actually in my name only, was canceled. The property management company that handled my rentals was instructed to no longer accept any instructions from Diane or anyone in her family. The hardware store was listed for sale, and the Elm Street property, the one with the safe, was transferred into an irrevocable trust controlled by Patricia. Diane found out on December 28th. She called me 17 times. I didn't answer. On the 18th call, she left a voicemail, and I'm going to play it for you exactly as she said it. "Michael, you listen to me. You have lost your mind. I don't know what Patricia Alvarez has told you, but you cannot do this. This is our money. This is our family. If you think you can just walk away and take everything, you are wrong. I will fight you. My mother will fight you. Richard will fight you. We will take you to court, and we will destroy you. You think you're strong now? You're not. You're the same weak man you've always been, and when this is over, everyone will see it." I saved that voicemail, because in a few minutes you're going to understand why it matters. On January 3rd, Diane's lawyer sent me a letter. They were claiming that Diane was entitled to half of all assets acquired during the marriage, standard divorce stuff. But Patricia had already prepared for this. She had documents, years of documents, bank statements showing that Diane had been secretly transferring money from our joint account into accounts in her name and Margaret's name over $200,000 over 10 years. Patricia also found something else, something that even I didn't know about. Diane and Richard had been using my properties as collateral for business loans without my knowledge. They had forged my signature on 2 documents, 2 loans totaling $180,000. That's not a divorce issue, that's fraud. Patricia said, "Michael, we can go to the police with this." I said, "Not yet." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I need to understand something first. I need to know why." I met Diane at a diner on January 10th. Neutral ground. She came alone, which surprised me. She looked tired. Not the polished, controlled Diane I had known for 30 years. She looked like a woman who had just realized the ground beneath her wasn't as solid as she thought. She said, "What do you want, Michael?" I said, "I want to know why you did it. The loans, the secret money, all of it. Was it greed?" Diane looked at me for a long time. And then she did something I had never seen her do. She cried. Not performative crying, not strategic crying, real crying. The kind that makes your whole body shake. She said, "It wasn't greed." I waited. She said, "My mother has been taking money from me since the day we got married, every month. Thousands of dollars. She said it was for family expenses. But it wasn't. Richard has gambling debts. He's had them for years. Margaret was covering them. And when Margaret couldn't cover them anymore, she came to me." I said, "So you used my money to cover Richard's gambling?" Diane said, "At first, but then it got bigger. And Margaret said if I didn't keep paying, she'd tell you things about me. Things from before we were married." I said, "What things?" Diane said, "Michael, please." I said, "What things, Diane?" She wiped her eyes. She said, "When I was 19, I was pregnant. Before I met you. I had an abortion. Margaret paid for it, and she's held it over me my entire life. She said if I ever crossed her, she'd tell everyone. She'd tell your mother. She'd tell the church. She'd destroy me." I sat there. Diane said, "You don't understand what it's like to be Margaret's daughter. You think she was cruel to you? She owned me, Michael. She owned me since I was a child. Every decision I made was to keep her happy. Every cruel thing I said to you. Every time I let Margaret humiliate you, I did it because I was terrified of her." I said, "So you made me the target instead of yourself?" Diane said, "Yes." I said, "And Sarah? Did you train her the same way Margaret trained you?" Diane closed her eyes. She nodded. I said, "You turned my daughter into another version of Margaret." Diane said, "I know." I sat back. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt something worse. I felt pity. Because Diane wasn't the mastermind I thought she was. She was another victim. A woman who had been controlled by her mother since birth, and had passed that control down to our daughter like a disease. But pity didn't change what she had done. I said, "Diane, I still need to protect myself. The forged loans. The stolen money. I can't just ignore that." She said, "I know." I said, "But I need you to do something for me." She said, "What?" I said, "Tell Sarah the truth. All of it. About Margaret. About Richard. About the abortion. About why you treated me the way you did. Tell her before Margaret does." Diane said, "Margaret will never forgive me." I said, "Margaret has been destroying you your whole life, Diane. When are you going to stop caring if she forgives you?" 3 days later, Diane went to Sarah's house. I wasn't there, but Sarah called me afterward, and she was sobbing. Sarah said, "Dad, Mom told me everything. About Grandma, about Uncle Richard, about the money, about the other thing." I said, "Are you okay?" Sarah said, "No, I'm not okay. My whole life I thought Grandma was this strong woman who had all the answers, and Mom was this perfect person who held our family together, and you were just the guy who was there. But it was all a lie. Everything was a lie." I said, "I know." Sarah said, "Dad, I said terrible things to you. On Christmas, I said you were weak. I said you were pathetic." I said, "You did." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." Long pause. Sarah said, "What's going to happen to us? To the house? To Brandon's business?" I said, "I'm not going to take your house, Sarah. I'm not going to destroy your family. But things are going to change. You and Brandon are going to stand on your own. No more secret money from me. No more bailouts. If Brandon's business fails, it fails. If you can't afford the school the kids go to public school, that's called real life." Sarah said, "Brandon's business might actually fail." I said, "Then he'll get a job, like everyone else." She laughed, a real laugh, not the performative one. And it was the first time in years I'd heard my daughter actually laugh. But the story doesn't end there. Because while I was dealing with Diane and Sarah, Something was happening with Richard on January 15th. I got a call from Patricia. She said, "Michael, Richard was arrested this morning." I said, "For what?" She said, "Embezzlement. He's been stealing from the company he works for. $240,000 over 4 years. They pressed charges." I said, "What does that have to do with me?" She said, "The forged loan documents. Richard's fingerprints are all over them. He signed your name. And when the police searched his house, they found copies of the forged documents. He was planning to use them again." I said, "So he's going down for the forgery too?" Patricia said, "That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is what else they found." I said, "What?" She said, "They found a life insurance policy, on you, taken out 3 years ago. The beneficiary is Margaret." I went cold. Patricia said, "It's a $2 million policy. Richard took it out through an online broker. He listed himself as your business partner. There's no record of you signing it. It's fraudulent. But the fact that it exists. Michael, someone was thinking about you dying." I sat in my truck outside the courthouse for 30 minutes. I couldn't move. Someone in my wife's family had taken out a life insurance policy on me. 3 years ago. $2 million. Was it Richard acting alone? Was Margaret involved? Was Diane? I didn't know. But I knew one thing. This wasn't just a toxic marriage anymore. This was something criminal. On January 22nd, I went to the police. Not just about the life insurance. About everything, the forged loans, the stolen money, the insurance policy. Detective Angela Morris took my statement. She was thorough, cold. She asked me questions for 3 hours. At the end she said, "Mr. Callahan, I need to ask you something directly. Do you believe your wife was involved in any of this?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "You've been married to her for 32 years. You don't know?" I said, "Detective, I've been married to her for 32 years. And I didn't know she was taking money from our accounts for 10 years. I didn't know her brother was forging my name. I didn't know there was a life insurance policy on my life. So no. I don't know if my wife was involved. Because it turns out I didn't know my wife at all." Detective Morris wrote something down. She said, "We're going to pull Diane in for questioning. I want you to understand what that means. She'll be interviewed at the station. It'll be recorded. It could become part of a criminal case." I said, "I understand." She said, "Are you sure you want to do this? This is your family." I said, "My family took out a life insurance policy on me, Detective." She nodded. Diane was questioned on January 25th. I wasn't there, but Patricia got me the transcript. Diane told the police everything. She threw Richard under the bus completely. She said Richard had acted alone on the forged loans. She said she didn't know about the life insurance policy. She said Margaret had pressured Richard into the whole thing. And then Diane said something that shocked even Patricia. Diane said, "I want to testify against my mother and my brother. I'll cooperate fully. I'll give you everything. Emails, bank records, recorded conversations. I've been recording my mother for 2 years. Patricia called me and said, "Michael, your wife has been secretly recording her own mother for 2 years." I said, "Why?" Patricia said, "Because Diane has been planning to escape Margaret for years. She just didn't know how. And when you finally snapped on Christmas, she realized this was her chance too." I didn't know what to feel. Diane had been a victim. But she had also been a victimizer. She had turned on me to protect herself from Margaret. She had used me as a shield. She had let her family destroy me. But she had also been collecting evidence. For years. Waiting. Just like me. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, Margaret Callahan was arrested. 71 years old, led out of her house in handcuffs. Richard was already in custody. Harold sat on the porch and watched and said nothing. The charges against Margaret were conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. Margaret's lawyer tried to get her released on bail. The judge denied it, called her a flight risk. When Margaret was being led to the police car, she looked at the reporters and said, "This is my daughter's revenge. She's been planning this for years. She married that man knowing she'd use him eventually." But nobody was buying it anymore. The trial started in April. It was a circus. Margaret, even at 71, was commanding and manipulative on the stand. She cried. She played the grandmother card. She said Diane was an ungrateful daughter who had been seduced by a lawyer into turning on her own family. But then Patricia played the recordings. Diane had recorded Margaret saying, on tape, "Richard, that policy on Michael is just insurance. If something happens to him, we're protected. It's not like anyone's going to actually do anything, it's just a policy. Just a policy, $2 million on my life," and Margaret called it just a policy. The jury didn't see it that way. Richard took a plea deal, 18 months. He'd be out in a year. Margaret was convicted on all counts, 4 years. At 71, Harold moved into a nursing home 2 weeks later. He never visited Margaret in prison. Not once. After the trial, I sat in the parking lot of the courthouse. Diane walked up to my truck. She stood outside the window. She said, "Michael, I know you probably hate me." I said, "I don't hate you, Diane." She said, "Then what do you feel?" I said, "I feel like I spent 32 years married to a woman who was fighting a war I didn't know existed. And instead of asking me for help, you made me the enemy." Diane said, "I didn't know how to ask. I never learned how. Margaret taught me that asking for help was weakness, and weakness was the one thing she couldn't tolerate." I said, "She taught you the same thing she taught Sarah, and Sarah said the same thing to me about weakness. You all learned it from the same person." Diane leaned against my truck. She said, "What happens to us now?" I said, "The divorce goes through. The house stays mine. You'll get a settlement. Enough to live on. Not enough to keep the lifestyle you're used to." She said, "I know." I said, "And Sarah and Kevin, they need to know the truth. All of it. Not just about Margaret, about how you treated me, about what you said about me to them. They need to hear you say it." Diane said, "I know that too." I started the truck. Diane said, "Michael?" I looked at her. She said, "I really did love you, in the beginning, before Margaret got inside my head, before I became her, I loved you." I said, "I loved you too, Diane, but love isn't enough when the person you love is also the person who's holding you underwater." She stepped back. I drove away. It's been 8 months since that Christmas dinner. Sarah and I are rebuilding our relationship, slowly. She comes over every Sunday now. She brings the kids. We cook together. She told me last week that she finally stood up to Margaret's side of the family at a gathering. She said, "I told them that if anyone ever speaks about my father the way they used to, I'll walk out and never come back." She said nobody said a word. Kevin and I are talking again. He's working at a marketing firm now, on his own. No help from Richard, no help from me. He told me, "Dad, I finally understand what you were trying to tell me that day about Uncle Richard. I just wasn't ready to hear it." Jenny is thriving. She's engaged to a good man. Tyler is in his junior year at Ohio State. I pay for his tuition, not secretly anymore, openly, proudly. My father died in March. Quietly, in his sleep, in the basement of his house, surrounded by birdhouses. My mother sold the house a month later and moved to Florida. She called me before she left and said, "Michael, I think I was too hard on you. I think I saw your father give up, and I didn't want you to do the same. But instead of helping you, I just pushed you the same way." I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." Diane and I are divorced. The papers were finalized in June. She's living in a small apartment in Lakewood. She goes to therapy 3 times a week. She calls me sometimes, not to reconcile, just to talk, like 2 people who survived the same war. Last week, she called me and said, "I told Sarah everything, about how I spoke about you, about the things I said behind your back, about how I trained her to see you as less than you were." I said, "How did Sarah take it?" Diane said, "She cried. And then she said, 'Mom, I forgive you, but I need time.'" I said, "That sounds like something a strong woman would say." Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Michael, do you think we could have been different if Margaret wasn't in the picture?" I thought about it. I really thought about it. I said, "I don't know, Diane, but I know this. The 2 of us, we weren't enemies. We were just 2 people who were handed a script by our families. And we read our lines without ever asking who wrote them." She didn't respond for a long time. Then she said, "I think that's the truest thing either of us has ever said. I'm sitting in my house right now, the same house Diane told me to leave on Christmas. My house, my table, my chair. There's a birdhouse on the mantel. My father made it, the last one he ever built. It's unpainted, rough wood, imperfect. It's the most beautiful thing I own." My phone is on the table next to me. No messages, no calls, just quiet. For the first time in 32 years, the quiet doesn't feel lonely. It feels like peace. My daughter told me to leave Christmas dinner. And I did. But I didn't leave because she told me to. I left because I finally realized that leaving wasn't weakness. It was the strongest thing I'd ever done.